Hi, and welcome to Art 100 Understanding Visual Culture. This module is about formal analysis, and we're going to start by distinguishing form and content, and that's the purpose of this PowerPoint. So form on the one hand, content on the other. In art history, we often call the content the subject matter. So what is the subject of a particular painting or work of art versus the style? How is it made? The sort of details of how it's rendered or put together. Okay, so we talk about both of those in art history, but we're going to be talking specifically about form today. Okay, so anytime you analyze something, you're breaking it down in order to understand it more clearly. And formal analysis is just the same as that. What you do is you take a work of art and you break it down into its component parts in order to observe it systematically, right? Make sure you cover everything and to understand it better, so that when you put it all back together, you do so with a better understanding of how the parts function individually and how they work together to create the whole work. All right, so let's take an extended example. The subject matter of this photograph could be very simply put, it's a woman in a poppy field. Okay, and I noted here on the slide a possible description because you remember last week we were working on our description writing. So often the description is really a basic discussion of the subject matter plus a little bit about the composition, right? So you might say, in this 1907 photograph, a young woman kneels in the foreground, gathering poppies in a gloomy meadow enlivened by bright orange flowers. Okay, so when you say she kneels in the foreground, you give a bit of a sense of the composition, but basically what you're talking about is the subject of the work. Okay, so now I want to take a look at another painting with the exact same subject, and you'll see it's pretty different stylistically. So this is where form and content are going to start to separate for us. Okay, so this is a painting actually from right around the same time by the German artist Paula Modersohn-Becker. And here you can see, if we write a brief description, we might have a woman in a poppy field for this as well. But obviously it's a really different picture, right? And it's not only different because we're looking at a sort of strong and stolid peasant woman who is sitting in the poppy field rather than a sort of girl clad in a white dress who's sort of romantically picking flowers. It's different because of the way Modersohn-Becker paints it as well, okay? And she's really trying to do something kind of different here, where the woman almost sort of looks like part of the earth, right? She almost kind of looks like a potato to me in terms of her rounded, earthy form. And you can see her face is kind of matched by that simplified tree in the background. At the same time, there's a lot of color here that's sort of bright against the darker brown background. One interesting detail of this painting is that she has a wedding ring on her finger. So very different, same subject, very different style, very different formal approach in these two works. So to look at a couple more that feature the same or similar subject, this is O'Keeffe's 1928 painting of Oriental poppies. And this is a landscape by the French artist Claude Monet from 1890. By contrast, this is a press photograph by a photographer who works as part of the Magnum Collective. And you can see that this image has a lot of similarities in terms of also depicting a wheat field with flowers, but is captioned with very specific information about where this is and what is depicted. So the first thing you want to ask when you're looking at any image is, what exactly am I looking at? What is this thing? Okay, and you want to remember to do this step. This is really important. And I sort of divided this into two parts, which I hope is helpful. First is, where does this image circulate? What is its function or its purpose? And who is it trying to speak to about what? Okay, so if we take the example of the Monet landscape versus the press photo of the poppy field, you could say, where are you going to encounter each of these? Well, in one, you might encounter it in a magazine or a newspaper. You might encounter it online illustrating an article, right? And in the other, you would encounter it in a museum or in a book or also online in an art collection, okay? But they're going to be in different places and they're going to be speaking to different audiences. Right? So for example, the Monet might reach someone who's just looking for a beautiful landscape. By contrast, the Stuart Franklin photograph is trying to give specific information, let me go back here, about organic growing practices. Right? So part of what this photograph is emphasizing is the way the poppies and other wildflowers are growing right in and alongside the wheat in this organic farm. Second question under what am I looking at is, what is the medium here? What specific formal features and possibilities does this medium possess? So that's another slightly tricky thing about comparing these two, is not only are they made for different audiences, circulate differently, and have different basic purposes, but they're also in different media. The Stuart Franklin is a photograph, whereas the Claude Monet is an oil painting. And that's going to mean that they look and feel different and have different sort of properties and characteristics. And you want to take a hold of those really seriously too when you're doing formal analysis. So a better comparison might be these two paintings, which were made within about 5 years of each other and are both made by painters in France who are fairly closely associated with each other. Seurat is sort of the next generation of Impressionists after Monet. And you can see here that despite a lot of similarities, like both are oil paintings, so same kind of a medium, paint on canvas, they actually have very similar dimensions. Both are 3 feet wide. The Monet is closer to 2 feet high, whereas the Seurat is closer to 2.5 feet high. Okay, so slightly different shapes, but very similar paintings. Now we really have a comparison, right, where we can sort of look at specific aspects of how these artists render their subjects. And that's one of the things that we would do with a formal or stylistic analysis. Okay, so one of the first distinctions that you might want to make right after you ask, what am I looking at and why does this matter to me, is whether you're looking at something that exists in 2 or 3 or more dimensions. So just really briefly, obviously, 2-dimensional is something that's relatively flat, like a drawing, a photograph, or a painting. 3 dimensions is something that's going to exist in space, like a piece of sculpture or installation art, or on a broader scale, architecture, like a whole building or a whole complex of buildings or a whole city street. That's getting more complex in 3 dimensions, obviously. And it gets even more complex if you add the dimension of time, as in film and video types of art. Okay, so we're going to start with the simplest to make it the clearest, which is art in 2 dimensions. In other words, things that are flat. And we've already looked at a bunch of these. We're going to look at more, but this would include drawings, paintings, prints, photographs, things like this that have a sort of 2-dimensional structure. Okay, so there's a long history of talking about the basic elements of 2-dimensional art. And we're going to kind of update this in the next PowerPoint, but right now I just want to give you a little bit of the history. Because for a long time there have been conversations about line and color as being the 2 most basic elements of any work of 2-dimensional art. Okay, and In Italy, these terms are obviously given in Italian, which is disegno versus colore. And in France, they had their version of this as well. So if you think about the idea of a design, it could either be a drawing or it could be a plan to make something. And if you look at a lot of work that's been made, first you make a drawing, and the idea is that you come to understand what you are doing and how you want to organize the composition. Essentially, you make all the decisions through drawing. Okay, so you decide on composition, and you might make changes later because if you actually look at the finished work by Ang, he actually significantly simplifies the composition. He eliminates a lot of the figures, he eliminates a lot of the architecture, and he compresses the space so that we're closer to the scene of action. But in a sense, he's planned it all out, and now he's just executing it. Okay, so the idea is that your decision-making process, your designing, your planning comes first, and then you simply execute according to that plan. And this is actually why in many, many schools still, you can't just go in and take a painting class. You have to take a drawing class before you take painting, because this idea is still with us, that the actual application of paint to the surface is sort of secondary. And what's most important is your ability to compose and plan and draw. Okay, anytime you make a rule, you're definitely going to find somebody to break it, especially if it's an artist, because they tend to be a very contrary group. Not that different, I guess, from engineers, scientists, inventors, entrepreneurs. If they get a rule, they want to break it. So some artists began to say, well, actually, paint is what paintings are made of. Okay, and so painting, color, the color itself is primary. And that's where the most important things happen, is not in the planning stages, not in pen and ink or whatever medium you're using to make your sketches, but in the actual process of painting itself. And so these artists began to really focus, and this is a workshop scene where you can see some apprentices. Here in the background are grinding colors for the master. I have a couple different slides of this here. This is a more modern photograph, and another modern artist, Pierre Bonnard. And this is actually quite an ancient paint palette with a grinding stone to grind up those pigments. All right, so if you take this idea that design comes first and it's most important, artists try to go against that. And specifically in the Italian context, the city of Florence, so artists such as Michelangelo and Raphael were closely associated with this idea that the most important thing was drawing, and then color was simply added. And the Venetians essentially take this and they turn it on its head. And part of this has to do with a very different medium that they're working in, because the Venetians are working in oil paint, whereas the Florentines are more often working in fresco. And oil paint allows you to softly blend the textures, so that if you look, for example, at the outline of her body, the sleeping Venus here, it's not the case that she's sort of outlined and then filled in. Actually, her body is built up out of very soft, subtle layers of paint. And of course, not just her body, but also the drapery, the grass, the surrounding landscape, the mountains in the distance, etc. And a later artist actually said, you know, flesh was the reason oil painting was invented. In other words, making these beautiful illusions of a very soft kind of blended quality was actually the great thing about painting. So obviously the Florentines would disagree, but that's sort of the debate between the two. So this also occurs in France, and essentially there is a sort of distinction between what's stuffy and time-worn, these sort of traditional rules that you learn in school, versus a fresh, new, and more exciting, spontaneous way of proceeding. And this gets played out in France as well. All right, thank you very much. And the next one's